Thank you, everyone, for watching that wonderful preview material. We are delighted to have you here with us today. I'm Molly Schwartzburg. I am delighted to invite you to the University of Virginia's Library Symposium, The Future of American Political Cartoons. I am a curator here at the Albert and Shirley Small Special Collections Library and co-curator of the exhibition Oliphant, Unpacking the Archive. I'm delighted to welcome the speakers for our first panel on the subject of challenges to freedom of expression in political cartoons today. Patrick Oliphant has been for his entire career a passionate defender of editorial cartoonists' ability to make work that will confront the powerful, expose the corrupt, and challenge audiences to face their own hypocrisy. While we were working to bring his archive to UVA, I was privileged to hear Patrick tell many stories about his career, and I was particularly struck by his explanations for why he left Australia to come to the United States. One explanation he gave was that there just wasn't much happening in Australia as compared to other parts of the world. But he also found himself stymied by editors at Australian newspapers who feared angering powerful politicians and who spiked Patrick's best cartoons accordingly. Patrick had no choice but to make more and more work on international topics. After visiting the US, Patrick realized that the only way he could do the work he needed to do was in the American news environment, where the spirit of the First Amendment trickled into editors' offices. He arrived here in 1964, a moment ripe for a young, exceptionally talented cartoonist. That year saw draft card burnings, the Warren Commission, the murder of civil rights activists in Mississippi, and the presidential contest between Barry Goldwater and Lyndon B. Johnson. Soon, Oliphant was off and running, and the American editorial cartoon has never been the same. Today, we are experiencing upheavals that rival those in 1964, a presidential impeachment, the Black Lives Matter movement, a climate crisis that is no longer just looming on the horizon, electoral interference, a global pandemic. But as we will hear from our panelists, cartoonists' ability to do their work in today's United States is not stable or confirmed. We will hear from three speakers on this topic. Adam Zyglis is staff editorial cartoonist at the Buffalo Daily News. Jen Sorensen is a cartoonist, graduate of the University of Virginia, and incoming president of the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists. And Rob Rogers is a political cartoonist in Pittsburgh, whose work can be seen widely in syndication. Adam, Jen, and Rob will each speak for about 10 minutes, and we will then open up the discussion to all of our visiting cartoonists, who will respond and add their thoughts. This will be followed by your questions for Adam, Jen, and Rob. We encourage you to use the Q&A function to submit your questions at any time during the session. With that, I welcome Adam to kick us off.
Thank you, Molly. Hello, everyone. It's really an honor to be here to celebrate the great Pat Oliphant. And it's wonderful to, right now share the stage with my talented colleagues, Jen and Rob, on this really important topic. And as Molly said, my name's Adam Zyglis, and I've been with the Buffalo News for about 16 years now. And today, I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes to hopefully explain how I came to understand how important cartoons are for freedom of speech in America. And I started that journey by really looking overseas to cartoonists that have struggles and that have massive challenges with freedom of expression to show how we take that for granted. And then I'll look back at the state we're in now and a few of the challenges we face from a hostile Trump administration to the challenges with social media and the internet. So let me share my screen here and I'll start my presentation. All right. So growing up, I knew cartoons were important, but then after I worked as an editorial cartoonist, people would tell me, you guys really hold the line with free speech. And it's something that I didn't really absorb, though, until I became president of the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists in 2015, 2016. I got involved in the organization, and we started looking at cartoonists around the world, which cartoonists around the world are being threatened every year. But when I started paying attention to them, I realized, what we have in America is unique, and we have to fight for it. So here, this first slide is this cartoonist, Atina Fagardani, this Iranian cartoonist, who had depicted, the cartoon below is a drawing of Iranian parliament. And she depicted them as animals, and they're voting, I believe, to restrict women's rights, of course, ironically. So she drew this, and she was arrested and sentenced to over 12 years in prison. She did go to jail, and she ended up serving 18 months. And this was, I think she was arrested in 2015. So I was involved in the AAEC, and we worked with this group, CRNI, Cartoonist Rights International, and we would help honor cartoonists from other countries, but even more importantly, try to help get them out of the country if they're threatened, if their families are being threatened from a government that was hostile to freedom of expression. And another cartoonist we have here is Musa Kart. The following year, in 2016, he's in Turkey, and President Erdogan, his cartoon is to the right here, the cartoon is to the left. He would depict President Erdogan and his corruption and caricature him. And, like many dictators and strongmen, the cartoon speaks in a visual language that can be very damning, and ridicule is not, these dictators are very sensitive to that because it transcends the written word, and it really has, a powerful effect. And so he was arrested along with other journalists, and he was sentenced to more than 4 years, I believe. He was, because of international pressure, he was released. But learning about this and seeing that these artists really just were trying to speak truth to power and using satire by, using caricature or drawing their leaders as animals. And then we come back to the United States. This is my cartoon of President Erdogan. I'm drawing the situation, realizing that I shouldn't take this for granted. And I have, as his mustache, I'm using to show the journalists that are imprisoned in here. So here we can draw our leaders as animals. And here's Donald Trump in 2017, the year after, biting the hand that feeds him, attacking the media. And, it's this weird symbiotic relationship with Trump, but he's very hostile. He has been, since his campaign to freedom of expression. So we can depict them as animals. We can go even farther and depict them as the ass of an animal. And here Donald Trump is the rear end of an elephant that John McCain is cleaning up after. And Trump has sort of represented the most vile parts of the Republican Party. So this was a cartoon that my editor was really reluctant to have me publish. And looking back, he almost said he regretted it at one point, because the environment at this point in 2017 was Trump was creating more and more of a hostile environment toward, journalists. And there was pressure put on to really be softer on Trump. And I'll get to that in a minute. So now I'm not taking it for granted anymore. I realize this freedom of expression, this power we have, this privilege in America is important, and we need to fight for it. But I thought, where does it come from? It comes from the First Amendment, and we're protected under the First Amendment, but there's a Supreme Court precedent that has reaffirmed this freedom. It's a landmark case called Hustler Magazine versus Falwell in 1988. And this slide is a movie they made subsequently, The People versus Larry Flint. It's a great movie. Woody Harrelson is wonderful in it. It's Courtney Love. So check it out if you can, if you're not familiar with the case. But the case hinges on this satirical ad, this parody of a Campari ad, this liquor ad. And it talks about Jerry Falwell, about his first time making love. And it turns out because he was drunk on Campari, it was with his mother in an outhouse. So it was very lowbrow humor. But if you notice at the very, very bottom in small print, of this slide. It says, "Ad parody, not to be taken seriously." So it even had that in there. Anyway, Jerry Falwell, though, sued, as retribution for this, defamation. It was kind of giving him a bad name. And the AAEC, the Association of Cartoonists, helped support Hustler magazine in this case. And it was a landmark case because if Falwell could win and he could, successfully sue this magazine, then politicians everywhere could sue political cartoonists for depicting them in an unflattering way, in a satirical manner. So luckily, the Supreme Court sided with Hustler magazine, and Chief Justice Rehnquist actually cited political cartoons as a protected space of satire and free speech as an example of why, Hustler magazine needs to be protected here. So back in the back to cartoon, we can, put public figures in an ad parody, liquor parody. This isn't party, but here it's absolute power corrupts absolutely. And having the president drunk on power, we've seen him, in this case was about him pardoning some criminals that he was connected with. But this power that corrupts him you have seen that it's sort of, he's being drawn to sort of some of these dictators overseas and has these tendencies. And some of the first things these dictators will do will crack down on dissent and free speech. So here in this slide, we have, this calls for retribution. We have China detaining poets, Iran, just like I mentioned, Atina Fagardani jailing artists, Turkey imprisoning cartoonists, and meanwhile now Trump, the president of the United States, calling for retribution for SNL for depicting him, which is really a satire like cartoons. So it's very troubling. Also, another angle of Trump sort of attacking the First Amendment would be his constant, refrain of "you're the enemy of the people." When journalists report truths that are inconvenient to him or unflattering, he's repeating this refrain, and then at the same time chumming up to dictators like Putin and Kim Jong-un, who truly are enemies of American democracy. So this has a chilling effect. This repeated fake news, enemy of the people calling, and his supporters really rallying with this, it's making editors sort of, gun shy. And he takes it a step further in 2018 here, after the brutal assassination of Jamil Khashoggi. Khashoggi was the Washington Post journalist who was murdered, and the men were linked to the Saudi government, and Mohammed bin Salman is this vulture over here. And it was around Thanksgiving, I'm having Trump, giving him a pass, when, not only was it an attack on an American journalist, conveniently, he's called the Washington Post fake news. And the Saudi government is not, the most democratic place, of course, in the world. So again, troubling and adding to the situation where the administration has a chilling effect on free speech. Another angle to that is the White House revoking press passes. Here, I'm depicting the press pool as a dunk tank and referring to Jim Acosta's press pass being revoked and other journalists being shut out, which again is the slippery slope of our erosion of free expression. So here we have the Trump administration. It's creating this challenge to freedom of speech, and they're really pushing hard on truths that are inconvenient. Now, the opposite end of the spectrum during this time, since the 2016 election, we have social media, really the wild west of free speech. And a free speech purist might love this, but because it's been sort of a wild west of free speech, we've had problems. And here, this is depicting how we've had Russian meddling and hate speech, and they've done nothing to stop it, to sort of push back against that. And, after the 2016 election, people have called out Zuckerberg and Facebook and said, we have to do something about this because it's actually hurting our civic debate and our the sense of objective truth in our country. It's being snubbed out here. But of course, they're like, nothing to see here. We're not taking responsibility. It's free speech. But then there was a reckoning. And there was an investigation. Zuckerberg was, on trial in a way. And here I have the Facebook cloud of angry emojis. raining down on him. And, he had his mea culpa. He said he's sorry. And this sort of was a turning point where these big social media companies, they felt the pressure to push back and, on hate speech and propaganda. So the next slide here, I have Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, finally, killing and flagging some of Trump's tweets. He's got one of the hundreds and hundreds of lies and hateful tweets that the president of the United States is putting out. So this is promising in the fight for truth. But the other side of this coin is when social media companies do start pushing back on some of this stuff, practitioners of free speech, like editorial cartoonists like myself, can get caught in the crosshairs, or we can get caught in the net that's cast to sort of stop some of this. And sure enough, one of my cartoons was removed from Instagram. I have the screen grab from my phone. It was very strange. So I had a cartoon that posted in January of 2020, and for some reason it was fine at that point. But months later, it was really just I would say like 1 or 2 months ago, I got this flagged and removed. And this was the cartoon that was removed. It was when Trump was escalating a conflict with Iran, and the U.S. had assassinated Soleimani, the Iranian commander in Iraq. It was killed. So the response was measured non-lethal missiles, but a lot of intelligence, high intelligence officials in the United States and commenters had worried at the time that they would pursue non-official responses like terrorist plots through Hezbollah and other actors that they are connected with. So this was not a radical opinion. And this is also speaking out against violence and dangerous groups. Yet I get flagged for being violent or dangerous. So this just represents this sort of new challenge. I think that you see the pendulum just swings back and forth. And, right now there's this sort of fight against, quelling of free speech in our administration, and the fight against propaganda and falsehoods. But we also need to push back against, like, when cartoonists and people producing satire, when we get censored, or not, not censored, but limited from social media, when really we're just trying to do good work. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with. And, I think to show you, this election is incredibly important, and we need to continue to fight beyond this election to maintain as much free speech as we can, and walk that fine line and find the balance between having as much free speech as we can, but also calling out hate speech and propaganda. So, we're not perfect, but we got to keep this experiment going and really do the best we can. So I think that's the time I have. And let me stop the screen and I will switch over to Jen Sorensen here. Let me just pop out. So thanks very much. And yeah, we'll continue to have questions on some of those slides. If you have any, just hold them for the Q&A. But thanks a lot. And Jen, are you ready to go?
I think so. Thanks, Adam.
Welcome.
I'm just going to start my share screen here, get that ready to go. Okay, how are we looking there? Okay, so first, thanks very much to the UVA Library for hosting this event. It is a real pleasure to return to my old stomping grounds, at least virtually. I used to work at the UVA Library when I was a student and after college, and I have many fond memories. I think today what I'm going to talk about is what I perceive as a major emerging threat to political cartooning in America. I know we talk a lot about news
Hi, everyone. I'm Rob Rogers, and it looks like Jen's screen froze up, so I'm going to share a video to see if we can, while we wait to see if we can get her back up. This is something I did right after the first debate. You may recall how contentious it was. So this is my take on that. And there's some sound from CNN. You may or may not be able to hear it, but
let me just say, Joe, I've done more in 47 months. I've done more than you've done in 47 years, Joe. No, Ukraine. No, sir. With $1 billion you know what? You're waiting. No, not true. So you said you went to Delaware State, but you forgot the name of your college. You didn't go to Delaware State. You're not true, gentlemen. I hate to raise my voice, but I hate to be. Why should that be different than the two of you, right? Vote now. Make sure you, in fact, let people know you're senators. I'm not going to answer the question. Why would you answer that question? The question is, Justice, radical left. Will you shut up, man? Listen, who is on your list, Joe? Everything he's saying so far is simply a lie. I'm not here to call out his lies. Everybody knows he's a liar. But I just want to make sure. I want to make sure. You ordered last in your class. There is no manifesto. Number one. Please let him speak, Mr. Number two. You just lost the left. Number two. You just lost the left. You agreed with Bernie Sanders on a plan. Folks, absolutely agreed. Folks, do you have any idea what this clown's doing? Hunter got thrown out of the military. He was thrown out, dishonorably discharged. That's not true. It wasn't cocaine use. And he didn't have a job until you became vice president. And once you became vice president, he made a fortune in Ukraine, in China.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you prepared to specifically do it?
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. You want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
right supremacists and right Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left.
okay, that was my video. Did we get Jen back?
Rob, I think we're going to let you go ahead and give your presentation.
Sure. All right, great. So thank you again to the UVA Library. This has been a real honor to be able to celebrate Pat Oliphant, who is one of my heroes. And I'm going to just start off by sharing my screen and showing you some slides.
Hi there, everyone. It's me talking.
Oops. My video is still sharing in the background here. Hold on one second. I got to turn that off.
You need to prepare one piece of.
That's what happens with YouTube. It automatically goes right to the next video. Okay. All right. So can everybody see my screen okay now? All right. I will begin. So for a brief moment in 2018, I was the most famous cartoonist on the planet, not because my cartoons were so brilliant, but because I was fired for drawing them. And more importantly, because the cartoons were making fun of the President of the United States. This is one of those cartoons that was killed during that period. I've always believed that the job of a political cartoonist is to punch up, not to punch down. And there is no higher up than the president. As any journalist or political cartoonist will tell you, if you're not keeping the most powerful person in the free world in check, you're not doing your job. For 25 years, I was the staff cartoonist for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. In other words, it was my job to draw cartoons about the president. In fact, I've drawn cartoons about all 5 previous presidents, including Reagan when I was at the Pittsburgh Press. This is him meeting with the Russians, and the guy is saying he's agreed to meet with you, but he won't wear the costume. Also, I drew George H.W. Bush. Here he is flip-flopping on taxes. Then came Bill Clinton, and we all know what his problems were. Did I mention the economy is doing great? Next came George W. Bush and weapons of mass destruction that were never found. And then, of course, we've got Obama. This was during the midterm shellacking, as he called it. He's saying, I had a hard time communicating my message. What did he say? He said he's a hardline communist messiah. And then, of course, the torch was passed to none other than Donald Trump. You would think that Trump would be the cartoonist's dream, right? There's just so much material, from his incessant tweeting to his games with Russia, where he was always the pawn, to his unique approach to natural disasters. This is Puerto Rico. To his infatuation with dictators like Kim Jong-un. Here he is saying, you're an unhinged, childish nuclear despot with insane hair. I know you are, but what am I? To his high crimes and misdemeanors. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And you would be... But I had a problem. The owner and publisher of my newspaper became infatuated with Trump and wanted me to stop criticizing the president. He even hired a new editor to keep me in line. And by keeping me in line, I mean that he was killing cartoons. Normally in any given year, I have 1 or 2 cartoons killed, up to that point anyway. And usually they were about something controversial like the Catholic Church and its numerous pedophile scandals. This is a cartoon from 2010, and the bishop behind him is saying, it's the annual hiding of the pedophile priests. Now, this cartoon did not make it into the Post-Gazette, but it did later get picked up in syndication and ran in USA Today, so I was happy about that. But since we're talking about the Catholic Church, and we are here to honor Pat Oliphant, I want to share with you one of my favorite cartoons by Oliphant, and it also is about the Catholic Church. This is his cartoon, The Celebration of Spring at St. Pedophilia's, the annual running of the altar boys. And I love this cartoon because it is so it is so funny about a topic that is just so horrific, and it's so well drawn, and also it's a cartoon that my publisher never would have let me get away with. So I was very envious of Pat. As I said, normally I would have 1 or 2 cartoons killed a year, but this new editor I had killed 18 cartoons in the 3 months that he was my editor. The last 6 were in a row, and there you see the 6 cartoons displayed. I'll show you 3 of them. This is the one I did for Memorial Day, where Trump is laying the wreath at the tomb of truth, honor, and rule of law. He really hated this one. And then this next one is kind of puzzling. I did a cartoon about Roseanne when Roseanne Barr tweeted those racist tweets. And at first I did a comparison to her show, her comedy, and the comedy that is our White House. And they didn't like that one. So I decided to draw this. She later blamed those tweets on medication. So I have this guy in the doctor's office saying, could it be the Ambien? Now, I'm not sure why they killed this one. I think it's because they were trying to send me a message that I needed to get in line. But this was like number 3 or 4. And then this cartoon is about the immigration policy of separating children at the border. And it's based on a famous road sign that used to be in California, sort of warning of immigrant families possibly crossing the road. And this one got picked up everywhere, and they were really not too happy with that one. Eventually, I was fired. And I'm not the first or the last cartoonist to ever lose a staff job. In fact, 1 year later, the New York Times decided to end all cartoons in their international edition. That's me being fired. Sorry. But here's the story about the New York Times International Edition. And Patrick Chapat, that's his cartoon. He was one of the cartoonists that lost that gig. And then a few weeks later, Michael Dieter, a Canadian cartoonist, lost a freelance gig that he had at a newspaper because of a cartoon about Trump that went viral. I'm sure you're all familiar with that one. So it isn't unique to me, but it certainly felt personal. After I was fired, a journalist said to me, your cartoons are no longer in the paper. Okay, it's just a cartoon. Why should we care? And I said, well, we should care because good political satire is a symptom of a healthy democracy. We expect people in power to be lampooned. It's who we are as a nation. The founding fathers knew the importance of satire. In fact, Ben Franklin and Paul Revere were both political cartoonists. They saw cartoons as a way of getting their message of revolution across to the people. This is Franklin's famous Join or Die cartoon encouraging the American colonies to unite against the crown. Today, we need cartoons more than ever. The media is under attack. Cartoons remind us that climate change is real. It reminds us that social media is not a good replacement for real journalism. Cartoons remind us that we can't keep killing each other with guns. Cartoons also remind us that we can't ignore our racist past. And they also remind us that absolute power corrupts absolutely, as Adam mentioned earlier. And finally, cartoonists remind us that elections have consequences. And in terms of reminding citizens about these issues, nobody did it better than Pat Oliphant. So it is an honor for me to be here and to be a part of this panel. And thank you very much.
And I'm just going to pop in and say, I'm hoping we're about to hear from Jen Sorensen. We'll see. Jen's had some technical difficulties on her end, and we're just going to give it a few seconds and see if we can get her going.
Hey there, can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, I seem to be having some router issues this morning. I'm not sure what's going on, so I may cut out again. I apologize for that, but we'll try to make this work. To begin again, I just want to say thanks to the UVA Library for hosting me, and it's really great to sort of come back to where I used to work as a student, and at least in a virtual way. So what I'd like to talk about today is authoritarianism and the threat of authoritarianism in the United States, and how perversely authoritarians are using the concept of freedom of expression to undermine freedom of expression. So I would like to start with a slide of a trip I took to Turkey. We're able to bring that up. This is me wearing a terribly tied headscarf in 2015, when I was invited to be a judge for a international cartoon contest. And it was an amazing experience. And one thing I noticed judging cartoons from that part of the world is, a lot of these cartoonists are operating under regimes that are known for human rights abuses. And so a lot of the cartoons are very symbolic and metaphorical, and not not so much like American political cartoons where we're making fun of specific political figures. So another thing that I noticed, I had a story to tell about after I was done judging the contest. I was on this pedestrian mall in Istanbul, and you can go ahead to the next slide here. I saw a protest taking place. It was a very small protest. It was maybe 100 people, and they were basically protesting domestic violence and violence against women. And you know, it was very peaceful, not that big, just kind of a curiosity in this public space where a lot of people are just busy shopping and going out to restaurants. So if we go to the next slide, I also noticed that there was a huge battalion of police gathering in sort of a buildup to this protest, and just tons of, you know, heavily armored police vehicles, and like way more police it seemed than there were even protesters. And I was like, huh, what's going on here? This looks kind of weird. And you know, lots of tourists were taking photos of the police. Now, if we go to the next slide, so all of a sudden there was a roar, and the entire crowd in the street started running, and people ran into shops, and the shopkeepers closed their doors and locked them, and people ran into alleys. And my husband and I just followed a bunch of people who seemed very scared, and they ran into an alley. And we watched as the police just totally converged on this little protest and, you know, overwhelmed them with force and just chased them off the pedestrian mall. And it felt like a real brush with violence. I'd never witnessed anything quite like that in the US. A few minutes later, everything went back to normal. Tourists were eating ice cream again. You know, it was like nothing had happened. But I was a little rattled by this. I'm like, man, that was a real sort of authoritarian gesture there for such a tiny little protest. So if we, you know, fast forward to 2020 here, the next slide. Now this isn't Turkey, this is the United States. And this was this past summer in Lafayette Square in Washington, DC, right across from the White House. We see a police officer just assaulting an Australian film crew that was covering this protest. And we go to the next slide. You can see how I included this guy in a cartoon about these incidents where the police are just, during the Black Lives Matter protests, I mean, there were just so many videos of the press being attacked and just peaceful protesters being attacked that it really reminded me of what I had seen in Turkey. And this guy actually sent me a really nice email because he saw the cartoon. And it's always great to know that the subjects of your cartoons have seen them and appreciate them. So that was kind of satisfying. And apparently he was okay, just sort of bruised and rattled. But anyway, I found this absolutely chilling and just a grave violation of freedom of expression. In the next slide, we see, you know, Omar Jimenez of CNN was arrested on live television while he was just covering the protests in Minneapolis. And I feel like these incidents were so not, you know, so abnormal and so chilling and authoritarian that we need to keep these in mind and not forget about them as we move forward into possibly even worse times for America. I'm going to share, the next slide is, now this is from a few years ago when, sadly, you know, Charlottesville was attacked by neo-Nazis. I'm gonna read this cartoon and then add a few comments. We see Trump in the back seat of the car being driven by the terrorist, the white supremacist terrorist there. Trump is saying actual quotes that he said. Part of the problem is nobody wants to hurt each other anymore. In the good old days, they used to treat them very, very rough. Knock the crap out of them. I promise you, I will pay for the legal fees. Now, I know someone who, in addition to Heather Heyer being killed, I know one of my college friends came very close to being killed. She was very close to that spot, a spot that I've walked 1,000 times as a student and a resident of Charlottesville. Another one of my friends was assaulted with a tiki torch, and he had a stroke after that. He needed a lot of medical care. So, I mean, what we're seeing here is, repeated attacks on protesters and demonization of protesters. And this is all very alarming, because protesters, to me, represent the very essence of freedom of expression. And, that is truly what America is about, and we need to defend the right to protest. So this brings me to some of the weapons that authoritarians use to belittle protest and to try and flip it around and do the switcheroo where they make protesters the real enemies. You can go to the next slide here. This week in authoritarian newspeak, cancel culture. We've all seen this. That person or thing is problematic. Cancel culture. Next slide. This term is an ideological weapon that lets one appear open-minded while shutting down discussion. The Trump campaign shouldn't be using Nazi symbols in a Facebook ad. Cancel culture, nah, 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 I can't hear you. Next. Curiously, it's only cancel culture if conservatives disagree with it. What about the right canceling climate science, peaceful protests, medical experts, journalism, trying to cancel PBS and NPR? That's not cancel culture, that's getting rid of the deep state. Next. Maybe the real cancel culture is throwing around lazy insults like cancel culture. You just use mindless catchphrases to dismiss all criticism you don't like. Politically correct, young woke. Not yet for the next one. Okay, so I feel like these phrases like cancel culture are authoritarian brainworms. They substitute for actual argument. They stop all thinking. They're just insults designed to diminish protest and belittle protest. And I know that as cartoonists, we often don't like to have cartoons criticized, but we have to remember that it's free speech too. If someone criticizes a cartoon because it maybe contains a racist stereotype, that is someone's free speech, right? And we don't want to just brush it off as cancel culture. We want to have a thoughtful discussion about it and use it as a learning experience. So now I guess we can move on to the next cartoon. This is an example of a few incidents of where people don't necessarily care about some free speech, freedom of expression issues. So here we have a woman shutting her computer down because alt-right mobs have deluged her with violent threats online. And this guy is just kind of whistling. And next panel. Dozens of peaceful inauguration protesters still face felony charges, and the guy's just snoring. Next panel. A historic movement to finally address sexual harassment arises and passions flare on social media. We see her tapping furiously, fire the bastard. Sound the alarm, Twitter feminists are ruining democracy. So, again, I feel as though one technique of authoritarians is to portray legitimate internet activism as a threat to free speech, which it is not. I think there is often a tendency for people to become abusive and intimidate people and to go too far, and that is definitely a problem with Twitter. There was a lot of absolutely toxic harassment of women who were activists in the video game industry to try and change the culture of video games, who were really just brutally harassed by certain people on the alt-right. And then when those women went to give public speeches, or when they just anything that they put online, I mean, they were met with all sorts of death threats. And then those very people who harassed them were often invited to college campuses. And when college students showed up to protest them, people blamed the college students for protesting. I feel that we can't let, these, we just can't demonize the protesters like that. When they're fighting the good fight against, often against neo-Nazis and authoritarianism. So I think that one thing that's very important to remember just is like, we can talk honestly about these issues. People can protest. We shouldn't muzzle ourselves in the name of free speech. The question is, how do we have these conversations? How can we thoughtfully consider the specifics of what people are talking about without just dismissing them with labels and insults? So we can move on to the next panel here. This, so how is authoritarianism actually threatening cartoonists? Well, one way is through just threats to journalists. Here we have a woman a reporter during the Black Lives Matter protests saying, "I'm getting shot." And this is when police were actually literally targeting her with pepper balls as she was reporting on the protests. This is violent intimidation of journalists. This is one way, one thing that could get worse in the future. And you can go to the next slide here. And here we have Devin Nunes's cow. If some of you are familiar with this absolutely frivolous lawsuit against a parody Twitter account, Devin Nunes, I guess representative of California, has been suing this woman who runs a parody account, making fun of him. It seems to me that these lawsuits do not get enough attention as a way of shutting down parody. We've seen George Lakoff get sued by a Trump crony. I think that going forward, this is something that we have to worry about as cartoonists and writers. And finally, in the last screen here, we have the sort of thing that's happening in other countries. So we have Ahmed Kabir Kishore of Bangladesh was the winner of this year's Courage in Cartooning Award from the Cartoonists Rights Network. And he had done some cartoons about the government's handling of coronavirus that they didn't like. And so they arrested him and they put him in jail under, these specious charges of issuing disinformation. And we're seeing an uptick in incidents like this around the world. And it seems to me like if the United States continues going in an authoritarian direction, we very well could see the kinds of things happening here that we've seen in other countries to our colleagues. And I'm very worried about it. So I hope everyone goes out and votes. That's all for my talk.
Jen, thank you so much for that. And thank you to all of our panelists. We're now going to welcome our other cartoon guests who are cartoonist guests who are currently in the audience and being promoted to panelists to join in a conversation and respond to what they've heard, add their own thoughts to these stories. And I guess I'd like to just sort of maybe start that conversation off by noting, I think we came full circle over the course of those panels from talking about the money of corporate ownership of newspapers all the way around to lawsuits and the wielding of money and financial power as a weapon against cartoonists. And with that, I'll leave it open to you if any of you have anything to say about that, and if any of our other cartoonists are able to join us and add their thoughts. So it looks like we have Ann Telmays, Signa Wilkinson, Cal Callagher, Matt Bors. We've got a whole bunch of wonderful folks up here to respond and share.
Molly, I'm not sure I understood your question. Could you repeat it again?
It wasn't really a question. It was more an observation that over the course of the discussion, one of the things that kept coming up was the use of money as a weapon against cartoonists. That seems to be something that's happening from at least those two fronts of corporate ownership and the kind of weaponizing of the law, lawsuits that basically will end up silencing a cartoonist. Are there other ways in which our skewed financial environment is perhaps making things worse?
Yeah, well, I certainly think that the economics of newspapers being what it is, you know, a staff job nowadays is kind of a luxury, but using the fear, at least in my case, using the fear of losing that job to sort of knuckle someone under it was definitely the case. And I think that it can happen in other ways too. I mean, I drew some cartoons being critical of our big healthcare system here in Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania, UPMC, and it wasn't just because of my cartoons, but the cartoons were sort of the last, you know, poke at the bear, and so they pulled all their advertising, which was like $1 million from the paper. And they were not happy with me, but in that case, you know, where their money was going out the door, they were still, you know, supporting me and saying, you know, the cartoons can run. So it is odd that you know, it just depends on what it is. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I just wanted to also add, I mean, we've talked about, you know, the corporate issue. I think we should probably talk about social media, you know, how that also can restrict editorial cartoonists. You know, all of us are pretty much on social media, and I think we probably all have had our experiences with people making it difficult to do what we do on social media. So, I mean, that's an ongoing problem, I think. I mean, while I'm a big believer in social media, and I obviously am on Twitter quite a bit, I do think that just the way it works and how fast it is, I think we have to deal with that. You know, we're learning, I think. I know I've learned how to deal with it more, but it's definitely something that editorial cartoonists are going to continue to have to address as long as social media is so important to the news industry, you know?
Yeah, we had a question from in the chat about the power of social media. Is Facebook too powerful for cartoonists to refuse to post their work on it? I'll just leave it at that.
Can you say that again?
Is Facebook too powerful for cartoonists to refuse to post their work on it?
It is for me because I'm dependent on, you know, the internet directly. I don't have a newspaper employer or anything. So all of, you know, readers are on social media. People, that's where they log into through apps, you know, Twitter and Facebook. And if you don't have a presence there, you're just not going to get, you're not going to get read, and you're not going to, you know, you can't transfer that over to people supporting you. So yeah, I don't like Facebook or Twitter, or really, I don't like these companies and what they represent or what they do with their power all that much, but you sort of have to publish on them.
I would add too, as someone that's on a daily paper, I'm told repeatedly that Facebook is what drives a lot of the eyeballs to the stories. So I'm told that my presence on Twitter and Instagram isn't as critical as Facebook, that they get a lot of traffic from Facebook. I mean, my work personally, I get more engagement or I feel like I have my own sort of audience that's almost separate from the news, my paper on Instagram or Twitter, where Facebook is more linked. So it's hard, like Matt said, it's like you have to have it, you go where your audience is. And so that's the power that these social media companies have. They know that, creators and people like need their audience. So it's finding that delicate balance. Like you gotta speak out. And like Anne mentioned, the issue of like sort of the anonymous like trolls, like people that they don't even put their name and they're trying to suppress your ideas just by sending hate speech. And they do that by sending the paper those things too, if you're on a paper. And I've had my editors I don't want them hearing about when someone crazy is repeatedly calling me or leaving horrible messages on my work line. That's an intimidation that's picked up since Trump. I've had one in particular reader who has gone, very threatening, starting with Trump's first campaign. And he's sort of taking cues from the man at the top, and they're trying to sort of suppress free expression by scaring the paper that something could happen. So like that's something that we have to live with now and just try to deal with.
There's a great question in the chat, and it's a little long. I'm going to read the whole thing. There's been some discussion of the role of memes in spreading spreading radical ideology. These memes seem sort of similar to political cartoons, almost like political cartoons for people who can't draw. There's a lot of ironic violence in ugly radical memes. Nudge and a wink, just kidding. And people riff on memes and pass them around. Could the panel cartoonists talk about how they see the activity of meme making and cartooning and how they might be similar or different? Signy, it looks like she's got something on that.
Yeah, I do think memes are cartoon forum for normal people who do not have a newspaper or a regular venue. I think there are a lot of them, and they aren't all radical against, they aren't all racist memes. A lot of them, especially if you're on a liberal loop, are all against Trump and, really strongly against. And which brings me back to something that was being talked about earlier about Facebook. Rob, you had a good cartoon about Facebook with its head in the ground earlier, but now people are talking about free speech is just too darn free on the internet, and hoping that it will be curtailed on platforms like Facebook. And frankly, I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be the person who chooses what gets on, what's okay and what's not. So I'm kind of worried about where this is going in the next few years, because the Zuckerberg and that ilk are fairly liberal, and they're moderately liberal anyway in what they do flag. But if somebody else wanted to run that site, they could flag any one of us too.
Cal.
Unmute yourself, Cal.
Still muted. Oh.
You're still muted, Cal.
We'll come back to you.
Okay.
Sign language.
Okay. Oh, here I am.
There he is.
Oh, there you are.
Here I am. It was my wife wanted me on mute, so that's the way that she takes care of me. Well, I want to echo actually what Signy was saying, is that in the realm of political cartoons, we've been on the front line of freedom of expression almost since we started this game. And where we are now, or where I feel we should be fighting, is the old adage that the best way to fight, suppression of free speech is with more free speech. But it's very painful, it's very difficult, and we're seeing the really ugly side of it playing out in social media, and I fear too that is going to get worse before it gets better. including the prospects of people in our profession or doing things like we do being physically threatened or worse. And so the challenge for us is to try to find a way to tame down those folks who want to suppress free thought. And if it doesn't happen in the United States, it's not going to happen anywhere. And so this is going to be a really trying time for us collectively, as well for the whole culture. And I suspect if Donald Trump is reelected and the Senate remains Republican, you will see really active ways to take on those critics in ways that would be really worrisome. Even if a Biden administration gets in, and even with a Democratic sweep, let's say, of our government, there'll still be challenges, in part because some of the people who abuse the freedoms of expression really are so upsetting to people that people are trying to find an answer, and the easy answer is to shut them off. The hard answer is to try to respond to them and find a way to live with them.
I think that's a great segue to the next question from our audience. And do add those questions to the Q&A if you have them. We've got a lot piling up and they're really wonderful. All of the cartoonists here are left-leaning as I am, says the questioner. I am wondering how conservative cartoonists would respond to the issues raised here. Rob.
I can speak to one aspect of it. I don't know about the social media aspect in terms of how the conservatives would respond to that, but I do know that, I'm a part of a newsletter called Counterpoint, and Cal is also a part of that, and they run cartoons by conservatives and liberals. And we recently had Rick McKee, one of our cartoonists that had been not censored, but the cartoon was changed a little bit so that it would be okay for Twitter. And I think that that's the problem. It doesn't really matter if you're liberal or conservative. If the social media giants are out there, like, protecting against certain words or certain topics, they're going to flag you. And that, I know that some of that is just unavoidable, but I think it's also because they haven't really caught up to where we are, and they don't have enough personnel or whatever it is to do the job right. But I think yeah, when there's an overzealousness at tamping down certain kinds of speech, we get caught up in it. I mean, yeah, they could say, well, we're just trying to stop hate speech, but editorial cartoons often deal with topics that are considered hate speech. So we in the algorithm, we get pulled in. And while I've never had anything, as far as I know, taken down off the internet, there have been other cartoonists, and I think it doesn't really matter if you're liberal or conservative.
Oh, I'm going to mention this in my panel next, which is about like drawing for polarized public, but I get stuff removed from Instagram and other websites to a lesser degree pretty regularly at the nib, and they're not even cartoons you would usually describe as controversial or too hot or something. It's just if something gets people the wrong way, if you get a certain number of conservatives reporting you, it sort of just trips and an automatic response, because a lot of the people, I think it's a lot of it's automated, and then the people who are reviewing this stuff are kind of like call center workers who just have to follow scripts, and they look at something and there's somebody being shot and they just go, okay, like whatever, it's violent, and then so that happens pretty regularly. The nib gets stuff removed from Instagram. I don't like it, but it's not the end of the world either. Sometimes we repost it and then the people who are reporting us have gone away, and then it just stays up.
Another great question in the chat. Are cartoons killed more often because of fear of a reaction from corporate ownership, or fear of the public's response? Or, and it sounds like we should add maybe, or fear of advertising being pulled. So those of you who work for a paper, which of those seems to be the trigger?
I have to say, I have to say, I have never had a cartoon pulled because of advertisers. I have had once, when I might speak to, well, once I had, right after the Danish cartoons, my editor said, I was working only at the Daily News, which is the city paper in Philadelphia. He said, this is not our fight and we're not going to get into it, which chafed me because I was speaking out of the paper about it in defense of the cartoons. But I gave it a couple days and came up with another one, and he was okay with that. So it ran, but the only one that didn't run was one when I started working for the Inquirer too. And that was a local cartoon where I called out a guy whose property, a wall, fell on a Salvation Army and killed several people. He was under construction, and he was using a cheesy construction group. An L&I inspector was so embarrassed about it, he committed suicide. The Black construction worker who was working on it gets convicted and sent to jail. And the guy who owned the building, nothing was happening to him. And so I did those 3-panel one with the last guy counting his money at his in his fancy penthouse. Well, it turns out it was the same building that an editor at the paper lived in, and he wouldn't let me run it in the Inquirer, and it ran in the Daily News. And so that's why you need more media outlets in every single town to have a place for controversial cartoons and of all kinds.
Anne, were you going to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think also another reason that cartoons will get killed is also because of what's going on, the tenor of the times. Because I remember during the Charlottesville protests and then the killing, I had 2 cartoons pulled. I mean, not published because I'm online, so they were not published online. Specifically because my editor thought, you know, I had a noose in there somewhere. I had Nazi stuff, and it was like, no. Now, having said that, then, you know, I took one of the ideas and went over to Matt, and and Matt Boers published it in the Nib. So, you know, it really has to do with, we also have to be very aware of, you know, how high the emotions are, you know, and our editors do that as well. So, you know, that's just a question of kind of figuring out, listening to your editor as well, but also figuring out, you know, how high the emotions are flying at that point.
Well, and it sounds like that's also an example of what Signe just said, of having as many media platforms as possible.
Right. You know, Matt's there. He'll print anything.
Go, Matt.
So speaking of paper versus not paper, we have a couple questions that are related that I want to ask. Somebody asked, Rob, how has your process changed since leaving the paper? And then another questioner said, to what extent does not being attached to a paper liberate cartoonists to freedom of expression? And to what extent do you think you would be better off with an editor guiding you away from unnecessary controversy?
Well, I'm in a unique position because my editor left under the same sort of terms of the publisher, you know, sort of falling for Trump. He was wanting to ask him to endorse Trump, you know, on the editorial page, and he refused. So there happened to be a buyout on the table, so he took it and left early. And so he left 2 years before I did, but we've kept in touch, and whenever I get stuck and I'm not sure about an idea, I can call him up and send it to him. So I still sort of have an editor on call, but I do miss having that daily conversation with my editor. letting me know if I'm like way out in left field or if I'm on the money. And that really helps to have someone to bounce these things off of, so you're not, sort of trapped in your own little bubble. But in terms of how my process has changed, it really hasn't changed that much. I mean, I was already working out of my home studio. I still would go into the office from time to time just for meetings and lunches. But when they moved to the new building, they got rid of my office because I wasn't important enough, I guess. But they only had like 4 offices, so everybody else sat out in the bullpen. So when I would go over there, I would sometimes work with the other writers, but mostly worked out of here, out of my home studio. So really for me, it was sort of that was probably one of the best things for me, losing the job and not having to change my daily routine, like move all my stuff out of there, like the walk of shame with all my cartoons. Well, they wouldn't have let me take the cartoons had I not already had them out of there. But thankfully I did. So my process hasn't changed that much. I'm still drawing for syndication. The one thing that is probably problematic is the creeping deadline, because since I don't have an actual newspaper that's publishing it the next day, I can work into the night, and that can be, bad.
I'm going to ask Adam to jump in next.
I had something I was going to mention on the last question, which can apply to this. This question of editors, are you better with them or without them? Sort of playing off of what like Anne was saying, and Signe before, I think the 16 years I've been at the news, the cartoons that have been spiked have been, I think it's because of the controversies that I've had before that. So the cartoons that have created problems have been around sensitive issues of death, and when the emotions are really high in terms of like people are killed, there's a tragedy, there's rape, there's abuse. And when you want to say something important during that time when emotions are really high, people that don't normally consume cartoons take offense to it, and then it spreads around to your critics will jump on that, and your critics will throw that in your face. And so then newspaper editors, for my editors, see that controversy and they don't like to feel that heat. I've never gotten feedback on advertisers at all, but because of those controversies in the past, that's the context that the editors have and how they view, will this be offensive or will this be something that I should worry about? And in a way, I think it's a blessing. I mean, it's a mixed thing. I appreciate that in some cases, my editor might be like, let's wait a day. And that sometimes I'll get a feedback like that. Instead of killing a cartoon, they'll say like, emotions are really high because this was a tragedy. It's an important point to be made, but just wait a day. And they're my editor, so I don't have a choice in the matter. But that is a better solution than no, we can't run this. I mean, I think we need editors and newspapers and publications that can kind of think in more of a gray spectrum of responses. There doesn't have to be like a kill this or not. We can say like, let's wait maybe a day or two. But yeah, I mean, I think the flip side to that is like Rob, I was jealous in the sense because you can be completely vicious and speak your mind freely when you don't have that editor, but you also don't have another set of eyes.
We'll end with a comment from Jen.
I wanted to say, just working in the alternative media for the past 20 years or so, I have had the incredible luxury of, I would say, never having an editor actually kill a cartoon. I've had just incredible freedom to say whatever I want. And it would be difficult for me to imagine, I think, working, for a daily where I'd encounter that, a lot. I did have one incident that I found, of an act of intimidation, basically, where I ran a cartoon, basically kind of making fun of parents who don't vaccinate their children. And an anti-vaxxer group got very angry about this. They vandalized the office of one of my newspapers. They staged a day-long protest about the cartoon. They harassed me and the newspaper with lots of phone calls and emails. And but in the end, the newspaper defended the cartoon and they stuck with me. And now that's a case where I feel like, yeah, I'm probably going to think twice before I do another cartoon like that one. So to that extent, you know, intimidation can work to sort of suppress freedom of expression. But also, I was very happy that the paper stood by me, and you know, they didn't cower or apologize.
I think that's a great note to end on, because our next session that starts at 2 o'clock is going to be about the polarization of today's audience. And it sounds like you were really hit by one of those polls, Jen. So thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation. And we look forward to seeing everybody again at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. Thank you.
Thank you.